I want you to stop whatever you're doing right now and listen to me, because what I'm about to tell you is not the kind of story that gets easier to carry the older you get. It doesn't get lighter. It doesn't soften at the edges with time the way people tell you pain is supposed to. It just sits there, right in the middle of your chest, between the sternum and the spine, and you learn to breathe around it. You learn to build your life around it the way a tree grows around a fence post, absorbing the obstacle, incorporating it, becoming a shape that you didn't originally intend to be, but that is now irreversibly what you are. I've been waiting to tell this story for a long time, not waiting in the sense of preparing, though I have done a great deal of preparing. Waiting in the sense of earning the right to it, waiting until the events had concluded in a way that was complete and final and irreversible, so that telling it would not be the act of a person who is still in the middle of something, but the act of a person who has reached the other side and is now, for the first time, looking back at the whole of it. I have reached the other side. I am looking back. And what I see is this: a machine that was built specifically around me by someone who was supposed to love me, designed with one purpose: to push me out of a life I believed was mine. And the story of what I did about that machine is the story of my adult life, for better and for worse, and mostly for both simultaneously. So let's start at the beginning. The real beginning, not the beginning that the story seems to have on its surface. My name doesn't matter. What matters is what happened to me, and what I did about it. Not in the heat of the moment, not in rage, not in a confrontation in a parking lot or a shouting match in a kitchen, or a lawsuit that would have cost me more than it cost them. I did it the slow way, the quiet way, the way that most people don't have the patience to attempt, because most people are not built, or more precisely, not unmade and rebuilt, in the particular way that this kind of patience requires. I grew up in a house that had everything. That is the first thing you need to understand, because this is not a story about deprivation. This is not a story about growing up poor and fighting toward comfort. The house was large, set back from a tree-lined street in the kind of Midwestern city that is prosperous enough to be comfortable and conservative enough to place enormous weight on appearances. The cars in the driveway were new. The vacations were real. Ski trips in Colorado in February, beach weeks in the Outer Banks in August, a long weekend in Chicago every November that I looked forward to more than any other event on the calendar. There was a study full of books, a kitchen that always smelled of something being prepared, a yard that was kept by a service that arrived every Tuesday morning with precision and efficiency. The man who owned all of this was my father, the man I called my father. His name was Warren Hargrove. Warren was a businessman in the true Midwestern sense of the word. Not a visionary or an innovator, not the kind of person whose name would be in any national publication, but rather the kind of man whose name meant something in the radius of 50 miles around, where he lived and worked and ran his company. A manufacturing and logistics business, mid-sized, privately held, that he had inherited from his own father and grown considerably over 30 years of steady, methodical, intelligent work. The kind of man whose handshake was worth something, whose word was worth something, whose reputation in the circles that mattered to him was impeccable. He was tall, with gray at his temples by the time I was old enough to really remember him clearly, and he carried himself with the ease of someone who has never in his adult life had to wonder whether he belonged in a room. He was a good listener. He was a better talker when the occasion required it. He had a quality of attention when he focused on you that made you feel, briefly and powerfully, like the most important person in his world. For the first 14 years of my life, I was certain that I was. My mother's name was Lydia. She was beautiful in the precise, contained way of certain women who have learned to hold their beauty the way you hold a valuable object, carefully, without showing you're aware of its value. She ran the house and our social calendar with a competence that looked effortless because she worked very hard to make it look effortless. She had a warmth that was genuine but calibrated, an affection that was real but measured. I understood, much later, that the measurement was not indifference. It was self-protection. It is a distinction that took me a long time to make, and making it did not change much, but it changed something. I was, by any reasonable assessment, a lucky child. I had a home and stability and education and material comfort in amounts that most of the world would not recognize as anything less than extraordinary fortune. I walked into my freshman year of high school believing that. I was not particularly remarkable when I started. I was the kind of student who worked hard enough to achieve solid results, but who had not yet found the thing that would ignite genuine passion. I read a great deal, history mostly, and biography, which Warren had always encouraged with a deliberateness that I now understand was itself a form of instruction, an introduction to the language he expected me to absorb. He used to say that if you wanted to understand the present, you had to understand the past, and you had to understand what other men had done when circumstances turned against them. He said the men who lasted were the ones who thought further ahead than everyone around them. He said patience was a form of intelligence that most people never developed because it was uncomfortable and slow. I absorbed all of it. I absorbed it completely, with the open and uncritical trust of a son who believes his father is giving him tools for the world. What I didn't know was that he was giving me the exact tools I would need to survive what he was about to do to me. Our high school was a large public school in the northern part of the city, about 1,200 students at any given time, big enough to have a reasonably developed social ecosystem with its own geography and its own rules. I had come out of middle school with a small circle of people I was comfortable with, not close friends in the deep sense, but the kind of social proximity that makes an environment livable. I was not popular in any notable way, but I was known, and being known without drama is a workable position. The school had the usual architecture of American adolescent social life: athletes and non-athletes, the visible and the invisible, the ones who moved through the building with the confidence of owners, and the ones who moved through it as guests, hoping not to be noticed by the people who ran it. I existed somewhere in the middle upper range of the guest category, not a nobody, but not a somebody. And then there was Shane Bradford. Shane Bradford arrived at our school in the first week of September of my freshman year, and within 72 hours of his arrival, the social architecture of the building had begun to reorganize itself around him. I've thought about this many times since, trying to analyze what exactly it was about him that produced that effect. It wasn't simply physical presence, though he had that. He was tall, well-built, with the easy athletic body of someone who has always been good at physical things. It wasn't simply confidence, though he had enormous amounts of that. There was something more specific and more sophisticated about it. It was the quality of his attention. Shane Bradford, when he chose to direct his attention at you, made you feel seen in a way that was almost intoxicating. And when he chose to withdraw that attention, you felt the absence immediately. He had the ability to make other people feel that their access to him was a privilege rather than simply a social interaction. And once you understand how that works, you understand how someone like him can take over a social environment in days. Teachers liked him within a week. Students liked him within 2. He was on the starting lineup of the junior varsity football team by October, not because he had any special previous experience, as far as I knew, but because the coaches recognized something in him that they trusted, and people who projected that kind of assurance tended to get the benefit of the doubt in every arena they entered. I didn't dislike him immediately. I had no reason to. Our paths didn't cross in any significant way for the first month of school, and I was aware of him only in the way you're aware of anyone who occupies a higher tier of the same ecosystem, with a kind of distant, impersonal acknowledgement. The first incident happened in October, in the history class we shared. The teacher, a man in his 50s who wore the same beige cardigan every Tuesday and Thursday, with the comfortable certainty of someone who had long since stopped worrying about whether anyone was paying attention to his wardrobe, had asked the class about the alliance systems leading into World War I. It was a question I could answer thoroughly, and I did. I talked about the Triple Alliance and the Triple Entente, about the web of mutual defense obligations that had turned a regional assassination into a continental catastrophe, about the way that mechanisms designed to prevent conflict had instead accelerated it. I talked for probably 2 minutes, long enough for the teacher to nod and make a note, long enough for 2 or 3 people in the row ahead of me to turn slightly in their seats, which at 15 I interpreted as engagement. When I stopped, there was a half-second of silence, and then, from the third row, Shane's voice, "Did he just spend 5 minutes explaining something from the first chapter?" A beat. Someone's really keeping up with the reading. It was quiet. It was brief. The teacher had already turned back to the board and didn't hear it or chose not to. But the people near Shane heard it, and there was a small sound, not quite laughter, more like the suppressed beginning of laughter, the social signal that acknowledges the joke without committing to it. And that small sound was enough. I looked at Shane. He was not looking at me. He had already returned his attention to his own notebook, as if the remark had been an involuntary aside, rather than a considered move. But there was a quality to his composure that I noticed even then, before I had any framework for understanding what I was seeing. It was the composure of a person who has done exactly what they intended to do and is now resting in the knowledge of it. I turned back to my own notebook and wrote nothing. But something had registered. Something small and specific had been placed in a register of my awareness that I didn't yet have a name for. That evening I told Warren about it. I sat across from him in the study, the room that smelled of old leather and wood and the faint trace of the single malt scotch he kept on the side table, and I described the incident in the flat, abbreviated way that teenagers describe things they're not yet sure how to categorize. Warren listened the way he always listened, with his elbows on the desk and his fingers pressed lightly together, his face attentive and still. When I finished, he asked for the name. I told him Shane Bradford. Something moved across Warren's face. It was fast, a fraction of a second, and if I had not been sitting directly across from him, 4 feet away, in a room with good lighting, I would have missed it entirely. It was not surprise. Surprise has a particular shape, the eyebrows, the slight parting of the lips, the momentary loosening of control. This was not that. This was the controlled response of a person receiving information they had been expecting, making a rapid internal adjustment before returning to the performance of neutrality. He asked me what I knew about Shane's family. I told him I knew nothing. He nodded slowly. "Don't worry about it," he said. "Sometimes new kids come into a school and they try to establish themselves quickly. It's a power move. Don't let it stick to you." I didn't let it stick, or I tried not to. The second incident came 3 weeks later. Our English teacher had assigned a personal essay, a piece about someone who had influenced our development. I'd written about Warren, not in the breathless, sentimental way of a child who doesn't know any better, but in the specific way of a 15-year-old who has genuinely absorbed lessons from a person he admires. I wrote about what he had taught me about patience and historical perspective, about the idea that the way you respond to adversity is the truest measure of your character. I was proud of it in the particular way you're proud of something, when you feel you've genuinely said what you meant to say. The teacher read excerpts from several essays aloud as examples of strong writing. Mine was one of them. She read 3 paragraphs, and the room was quiet in that particular way rooms go quiet when something is landing. Not silent from boredom, but still from attention. When she stopped reading, there was a pause. And then, from the third row, quiet and perfectly calibrated. "Must be nice to write a 5-page love letter to your dad's bank account." This time the laughter was more definite. 7 or 8 people, enough to establish something in the social record of that classroom that could not be unwritten. I sat very still. I kept my face neutral with a deliberateness that cost me something. The effort of the stillness was visible in the tightening of my jaw and the particular way I was holding my pen. I kept my eyes on my desk and I waited for the moment to pass. After class, 2 people came up and said they'd liked the essay. Both of them were looking at me with the particular expression that kind people have when they are trying to counteract damage. A warmth that is genuine, but that is also a form of acknowledgement that the damage has been done. Kind words from witnesses. They sit strangely. they mean well and land wrong. That evening I told Warren. He listened. He said he was proud of me for how I'd handled it. He said kids like that were usually working through something at home, and that the behavior was more about them than about me. He said to keep my head up. I believed every word. October of freshman year became November. November became December. The winter break was quiet. Warren was focused on some end-of-year business matters. My mother was managing the social calendar of the holiday season with her usual precision, and I read and thought and slowly, without fully recognizing what I was doing, began keeping a kind of informal mental record. Not of the incidents themselves. I didn't catalog them yet. Didn't assign dates or map them against any pattern. It was more like the instinct a body develops around a recurring pain, an increased awareness of the conditions that precede it, a readiness that is not yet preparation but is no longer pure surprise. When we came back from break, Shane Bradford's position in the school's social hierarchy had consolidated further. He was now at the center of a group that included most of the varsity athletes, several of the more socially prominent girls, and a scattering of students who, in my estimation, were there primarily because being near Shane Bradford meant being near the warmth he radiated. He had a girlfriend. By February, a girl named Marissa who was kind and popular in a way that was also partly a reflection of being chosen by him. By February of my freshman year, I was eating lunch alone 3 or 4 days out of 5. This had happened gradually, almost imperceptibly, a slow drift that I might have been able to arrest if I'd noticed it sooner, but that I didn't notice until it was already the established pattern. It wasn't that people had explicitly decided to exclude me. It was subtler than that. The ambient signal, the accumulated weight of those small, carefully placed moments in class, had communicated something to the social body of the building. Not that I was dangerous or unpleasant, but that I was marked. That associating with me involved absorbing some of the quality I seemed to carry. That the social math of being near me didn't work in your favor. I understand now, with adult precision, exactly how that mechanism works. At 15, I could only feel the effect, without understanding the cause. I ate lunch alone, and I told myself that I preferred it, and some days I believed it. The third incident is the one I think of most from that year. There was a girl named Paige who sat next to me in chemistry. She was the kind of person who makes the social texture of a difficult environment genuinely more bearable, naturally warm without any performance in it. The kind of kindness that is simply a baseline characteristic rather than a social strategy. We had built something over the course of the fall semester. Not quite a friendship, but a genuine warmth. A mutual recognition between two people who had landed in adjacent seats and discovered they made each other's experience of the class more interesting. One afternoon in early November, we were working through a lab together, and I was telling her something about a book I was reading, a biography of a 19th century railroad magnate, which she found alternatively fascinating and ridiculous in the specific way of a smart 15-year-old encountering an enthusiasm for industrial history. And I was laughing, genuinely, for the first time in weeks. Not the polite or social laugh, but the real one, the one that you can't manufacture, the one that means you are actually present in a moment without anything else intruding. Shane Bradford walked past our table. He slowed, almost imperceptibly. He looked at me, and then at Paige, and he said, with the ease of someone who does this the way other people breathe, "Careful, Paige. Listening to him is where afternoons go to die." He smiled at her, the particular smile he had, the one that was inclusive and warm, and invited you to be on his side of the moment, and kept walking. Paige looked at me. I looked at the lab worksheet in front of me. There was a silence of about 3 seconds that felt much longer than 3 seconds. After that, she was still kind to me. But the ease was gone. The warmth had acquired a slight self-consciousness, a faint hesitation that hadn't been there before. The thing that had been natural between us became slightly managed, and managed warmth is not the same thing as warmth. It has a different texture. You can feel the management. By December, we mostly talked about chemistry. That night, I told Warren about it. I described what Shane had said, and I described the effect on the friendship. Warren listened carefully. He said that kids like Shane often targeted warmth in other people, that making someone feel isolated from sources of genuine connection was a way of keeping them destabilized. He said that the best thing I could do was focus on my own development and not give these incidents the power of too much attention. He also asked me, in a tone that was curious without being pointed, about Paige, about how long we'd been talking, what we talked about, whether she knew much about my family, whether I had told her anything about him. I told him, of course. I told him. He was my father, and he was asking, and I had no reason in the world to believe that the information was going to be used for anything other than the warm and protective concern that was, as far as I knew, what it had always been. 3 weeks later, Paige's warmth had cooled to its managed baseline. I've spent years wondering whether there's a direct connection there. I believe there is. I can't prove it. But I believe it. The spring semester of freshman year passed. The summer was long and strange in the way that summers are strange when you are in the middle of an experience that you don't yet have the framework to understand. I played baseball badly, read 4 or 5 books, spent time with Warren on the weekends in a way that I now understand I was actively cultivating, seeking his company more deliberately than I otherwise might have, because his company was associated with the feeling of being understood and valued, and the school year had gone some distance toward making me feel neither. I came back for sophomore year with a specific and conscious intention to find ways to participate in the school that were less vulnerable to Shane Bradford's particular form of interference. I signed up for the debate team. I took an advanced history course that met in the mornings with a different cohort of students, people who had self-selected for academic intensity and were therefore less invested in the social dynamics of the main school population. I was careful and deliberate, and it worked, to a limited degree. The debate team gave me a context in which my tendency toward careful argument was valued rather than mocked, and the morning history class gave me 2 or 3 people to talk to who had no particular relationship with Shane Bradford's orbit. The problem was that most of my days were still spent in the shared spaces of the school, the cafeteria, the hallways, the classes we shared, and in those spaces, nothing had changed. October of my sophomore year brought the campaign incident. There was a student government election, the treasurer position was open, and a teacher I trusted had encouraged me to run, not because anyone expected a realistic chance of winning, but because she thought the experience of organizing and presenting and putting myself forward would be useful to me. I took the suggestion seriously. I made a poster. I wrote a short speech about financial transparency and accountability, ideas I had absorbed from years of listening to Warren talk about business, and I prepared it with the same care I brought to everything that mattered to me. The morning of the vote, I arrived at school to find my campaign poster had been replaced. The replacement was precisely, technically, almost professionally constructed. It had the same format, the same basic design elements, the same layout. But several small things had been changed with a deliberateness that was unmistakable once you knew what you were looking at. The color of my name was slightly off, just enough to read as unintentional but chosen with enough irony that anyone paying attention would catch it. The tagline I had written had a single word altered, a change that shifted its meaning from earnest to inadvertently absurd. A small graphic element had been modified in a way that made the whole thing look, at a glance, like a joke that the candidate themselves might have made. 4 people told me about it before I found it myself. They all had that look, the one that contains genuine sympathy layered over involuntary amusement, which is, in its own way, the most degrading possible combination. I lost the election. I would have lost it anyway. I was not the kind of student government candidate who won elections. But I lost it having been made ridiculous first, publicly, in front of everyone who passed through that hallway that morning. And there is a particular cost to that kind of public absurdity that is separate from the cost of simply losing. You carry it in a different part of your body. I never proved it was Shane. I tried to think through who else it might have been, because I wanted very much to have at least two options. But I could only construct one. He was the only person in the building with both the motive and the particular skill set that the modification required. The social intelligence to know exactly how far to push without going far enough to be punishable. The aesthetic sense to execute it in a way that looked almost accidental. And when I walked past him in the hallway that afternoon, he had the specific quality of composure that I had begun to recognize as his resting state after a successful action. Not triumphant, not even satisfied exactly, just settled. The composure of someone who has done what they meant to do and is now complete. That night at dinner, I said almost nothing. For the first time in the pattern that had established itself over this previous 18 months, I didn't tell Warren about it. Not because I had decided not to tell him. I hadn't made any decision at all. It was purely instinctive, a resistance that I couldn't explain yet, but that my body was already expressing before my mind had caught up with it. A reluctance to offer this particular wound for the kind of careful, warm, analyzing attention that Warren applied to everything I brought him. He noticed my silence. He asked if I was all right. I told him it had been a long day. He nodded and asked about practice, and I told him about practice, and the dinner moved on. 1 week later, Shane Bradford's behavior toward me ratcheted up. Not dramatically. There was no explosion, no sudden escalation that would have been visible and actionable. Just an increase in frequency and precision, the way a pressure builds in a system when you add more of whatever the system runs on. A comment in class, a thing said in passing, a moment engineered at just the right time to just the right audience. Each incident calibrated perfectly to the threshold of what could be identified and reported versus what could be dismissed as the normal social friction of high school. I was a fairly intelligent person. I was, for my age, reasonably analytically capable, but I was also 16, and I was inside the situation, and I had a father I trusted completely, and the idea that those two facts, the intelligence and the trust, were in conflict with each other had not yet surfaced to my conscious awareness. The evening that changed everything happened on a Wednesday in late April of my junior year. I want to be precise about the details because they matter. Track practice had been cut short. Coach had let us go 45 minutes early because a spring storm was moving in from the west, the kind of low, fast-moving front that the Midwest produces in late spring, turning the afternoon sky a particular shade of dark gray-green that means weather is coming. I drove home on roads that were already spitting with the beginning of rain, parked in the driveway, and came in through the side door. I dropped my bag in the mudroom. I went to the kitchen. I got a glass of water. I walked toward the back of the house, toward the stairs. Warren's office was at the back of the ground floor, with a heavy door that was almost always closed. The hallway was carpeted and quiet. The furnace had recently cut off, and the house was in one of those brief silences when a mechanical system has paused, and the building seems to hold its breath. I heard a voice. I stopped. Even before I had consciously identified the voice, something in me had already responded to it. A physical alertness, a tightening in my chest and shoulders that predated rational recognition. And then the recognition came. The voice was Shane Bradford's. I stood very still in the hallway. My heart was moving in a way I was aware of. I focused on my breathing and kept it even. Shane was saying something, and I caught the end of a sentence. Made him look like a complete idiot in front of the whole class again today. Practically fell apart. And then Warren's voice, calm, measured, with the familiar quality of a man who is not remotely surprised by anything he is hearing. Good. Keep pushing. He won't be here much longer anyway. The air in the hallway changed. Or rather, what I was feeling changed so completely that the air seemed to change. I did not move. Shane said something I didn't fully catch. The words were lower. And then, distinctly, I heard, "What if he starts putting it together, getting suspicious?" And Warren's reply, in the same steady and unbothered voice that I had heard 1,000 times, giving me advice and expressing support, and telling me he was proud of me. He won't. He thinks I'm protecting him. I don't know how long I stood in that hallway. Time did something strange. It's the only way I know how to describe it. Time did something strange, and when it stopped doing that strange thing, I was still standing in the same place, and the voices had moved to something else, some mundane topic, something that sounded like logistics, and I was aware of myself breathing. I walked away from the door, not running, not stumbling, walking, quietly and carefully on the thick carpet, the way you move when you have understood instinctively that discovery would be catastrophic, and that everything depends on giving nothing away. I went upstairs, I sat on the edge of my bed, and I looked at the wall in front of me, which was pale blue, which I had chosen when we repainted 2 years ago, and I breathed. I sat there for a long time. I want you to sit with this moment for a second. I want you to actually imagine it, not as a story beat, not as the dramatic pivot in a narrative you're consuming. I want you to imagine that you are 16 years old and you have just learned that the person you have trusted completely, the person you have gone to with every hurt and every confusion for 2 years, the person who has been your primary source of comfort in an environment that has been systematically, deliberately made hostile, that this person is the architect of the hostility, that every time you brought your wounds to him, you were handing him a map of where to hit harder, that the care and the attention and the warmth were all real, and all a performance, and the performance existed in the service of the opposite of what you believed it served. Put it in the comments right now. I want to know what you would have done. If you were 16 and you were sitting on the edge of your bed and you had just heard that, what would you have done? Would you have walked back down to that office? Would you have called someone? Would you have run? Because I've asked myself that question 1,000 times, and I still don't know what the right answer is. All I know is what I did. I sat on the edge of my bed for a long time, and then I went downstairs and had dinner with my father. He asked about practice. I told him practice had ended early because of the weather. He said he'd noticed the storm. He asked what we were working on in track. I told him. He asked about a history paper I'd mentioned the week before. I told him it was coming along. I went to bed. I lay on my back in the dark for a very long time, listening to the storm move through, and I thought. I thought about what I had heard and what it meant and what I was going to do with it. Not in the specific way of someone who has a plan. I had no plan. I had nothing approaching a plan. I was 16, and I had just had the foundation of my world removed in 45 seconds in a carpeted hallway. But I thought in the way that a person thinks when they have suddenly understood something that recontextualizes everything before it, when all the pieces that previously seemed random have suddenly arranged themselves into a pattern so clear and complete that you can't believe you didn't see it before. The incidents, the precise timing, the specific knowledge, the things Shane had known that I had only ever told Warren, the escalations that came in the weeks after I had described to Warren exactly what was hurting me, the poster, and Warren asking which hallway, with that particular tone of careful attention. He had been the source of the ammunition. Every time I had sat across from him in that study and offered my wounds like a child offering something precious to a parent, he had taken the information and handed it to Shane Bradford. And Shane Bradford had used it. And Warren had listened to the results and told me to keep my head up. I had been feeding the machine myself. Every week, reliably and completely, I had walked up to the machine and offered it everything it needed to run. The next morning I went to school. Shane interrupted me in chemistry class. A thing about my pronunciation of a chemical compound, precise and brief and calibrated perfectly. The room laughed. I looked at him for exactly 1 second, the way you look at something you are genuinely seeing for the first time, and then I looked away. Something in me had changed overnight, not visibly. Nothing in my expression or my posture had changed. But internally, in the orientation of my attention and the purpose of my energy, something had shifted from open to closed, from trusting to accounting, from child to something else that I didn't have a name for yet, but that felt, paradoxically, more adult than anything I had previously experienced. I told no one what I had heard, not my mother, Not a teacher. Not Warren, obviously. Not anyone. I went back to school the next day and the day after. I let Shane Bradford continue to do what he was doing. I let Warren continue to ask his careful questions and make his careful supportive sounds. I gave them both nothing of value. I maintained the performance of the son who was bruised but coping, who was still trusting the protection he was being offered, who had no idea what was actually happening. I was not a good actor by any natural talent. I became a good actor through the specific discipline of necessity. Over the following months, I began doing what I had not done before. I began watching, not just experiencing the incidents as they happened, but watching them, attending to the timing, the specificity, the information contained in each one. And I began to see the pattern that I had been too trusting to see before. October of freshman year. I tell Warren I'm struggling in algebra and feel stupid about it. 2 weeks later, Shane makes a comment in class about students who need help with subjects that come naturally to everyone else. January of sophomore year. I tell Warren that Paige and I are becoming friends, that I've told her some things about my family, that I think she's someone I can actually talk to. The warmth between Paige and me begins to cool approximately 2 weeks after that conversation. March of sophomore year. I tell Warren about the student government race, which hallway the poster is in, how much it matters to me. The poster incident happens within days. The escalation in Shane's behavior follows within a week. I went back through every significant incident over 2.5 years. Not all of them mapped, but enough did. Far more than chance or coincidence could account for. The pattern was not subtle once I was looking for it. It had the deliberate, consistent architecture of something that was being managed. I had been 16 years old, living in the architect's house, eating dinner with him every night, bringing him everything he needed to maintain the structure. I was 17 now, and I was done. I stopped telling Warren about Shane Bradford. I continued to talk to him about other things, school in general, books, sports, the kind of quotidian, domestic conversation that fills the space between people who share a living environment. I kept my voice even and my demeanor unchanged. I performed the functional, slightly distant normalcy of a teenager who is simply growing up and growing slightly more private in the way that teenagers do. He noticed to some extent. There were a few moments when he seemed to probe slightly, asking about school in ways that were angled toward the specific social information I had previously supplied. I gave him nothing. General answers. Things that sounded like the ordinary observations of a teenager who was simply less forthcoming than he used to be. He didn't push. He didn't show his hand. He was too controlled for that. So was I, now. The second semester of junior year continued. Shane Bradford's campaign continued too, though it had lost some of its precision. Without fresh intelligence about my vulnerabilities, some of the incidents had a slightly less targeted quality. They were still damaging, still designed to maintain the social signal that had been established over the previous 2.5 years. But they were slightly less exact, and slightly less exact was, in the circumstances, a form of progress. I began thinking about what I would do with what I knew, not in the specific strategic sense. I was 17, I had no resources, and no leverage, and no clear plan. But I began to understand, with a clarity that felt both new and strangely familiar, that whatever I was going to do, I was going to have to do from a position of strength. That the only language in which the conversation I ultimately needed to have could be conducted was the language of structural power, and I had none of it yet, and building it was going to take a very long time. I made a decision that I have not second-guessed since, even in the moments when it was most costly. I decided to be patient, not in the passive sense, not the patience of someone who is waiting to be saved, the active patience of someone who has assessed the timeline required and is willing to work within it, however long it is. Senior year was the strangest year of my life up to that point, for reasons that were entirely invisible from the outside. On the surface, it looked like the senior year of a reasonably successful, reasonably quiet student. Decent grades, some extracurricular participation, a social profile that was not remarkable in any direction. Internally, it was the year I began the work of becoming someone who could eventually do what needed to be done. I applied to colleges that were as far from my hometown as possible, while still being excellent academically. I was accepted to several. I chose a large research university on the East Coast, partly for its finance program and partly for the distance, which felt necessary in a way that was more physical than strategic. I needed to be in a place where Warren was not, where his network and his presence and his particular quality of watchful attention were not ambient features of my environment. Shane Bradford graduated as a minor celebrity of our school, class president, valedictorian candidate, varsity athlete, student recognized for leadership and community contribution. His speech at the senior ceremony made several parents cry. He shook hands with administrators with the easy warmth of someone who has always known he belonged. He was going to a good school. He had a future that had been carefully prepared for him in ways that most of the room could not see. And I left. I want to tell you about the summer before I left, because I think it is one of the most psychologically important periods of the entire story, even though on its surface it is almost entirely uneventful. I was 18 years old, living in Warren's house for the last summer, performing the domestic normalcy of a son who is preparing to leave for college while carrying, in the back of my mind like a stone that never warms, the complete knowledge of what had been done to me and the complete absence of any clear idea of what I was eventually going to do about it. I was in the particular position of someone who knows the truth but cannot yet use it, who has the information without the power, the map without the tools. That summer I began something I have continued every day since. I started keeping a written record. Not on paper. Paper could be found. Paper could be read. On a device that had no connection to any account Warren could access. Encrypted with a password that I changed every month, I began documenting everything I could remember, every incident I could date, every conversation I could recall, the things I had noticed about Shane Bradford's knowledge of my private life, the things I had told Warren and the things that had followed, the specific texture of Warren's responses on the night I had heard the conversation, and on every occasion afterward. I filled 14 pages in, the first sitting. I filled 40 pages by the end of the first month. By the time I left for college in August, I had 90 pages of careful, organized memory. Not evidence, not yet, but the foundation of an account that, at some future point, might be part of something more. Warren drove me to the airport on the morning I left. He helped carry my bags to the security line. He hugged me and told me he was proud of me. His eyes were warm and careful and absolutely opaque. I had spent a summer performing indifference to the things I knew, and I was getting better at the performance. I called him when I landed. I thanked him for the ride. I said I'd talk to him soon. I walked to my dormitory and sat on the unfamiliar bed and let myself feel, for the first time in months, the actual shape of what I was carrying. Not the anger. I had already understood that anger was expensive fuel, and I was planning a very long trip. But the grief of a person who has loved the wrong person completely, who has built their entire sense of being valued and understood around a relationship that was, at its core, a performance, not on their part, but on the others. That grief is not something I can fully describe. It does not go away. It changes over time. It calcifies, it recedes as a daily presence, it becomes something you have learned to live around. But it does not go away. It is the particular grief of a retroactive loss, the loss of a past that you now know was not the past you believed you were living. You go back through your memories of warmth and support, and the specific comfort of feeling loved by a parent, and every single one of them is now double exposed. The experience as you lived it, and the experience as it actually was. And you can never separate those two images into clean originals again. You live with the double exposure for the rest of your life. I metabolized it. Slowly, over months and then years. Not completely, I don't think these things metabolize completely, but enough to function, enough to build, enough to stay oriented toward the long-term goal that I was only beginning to understand. I chose my major carefully, finance and economics, with a concentration in corporate structure. I had already understood, from a decade and a half of watching Warren operate, that money was not primarily about comfort. Money was about leverage, and leverage was the only language in which the conversation I eventually needed to have could be conducted. I needed to become fluent in that language, and fluency takes years and requires full immersion. My first 2 years of college were the most solitary I'd known. Not painfully so. The isolation of high school, the specific social damage of that environment, had prepared me for self-sufficiency in ways that made the independence of college life genuinely manageable. I studied hard. I went to lectures willingly, including ones I wasn't required to attend. I read constantly, not just the assigned material, but the surrounding literature, the case studies, the biographies of the men who had built and dismantled and rebuilt companies across the history of the American economy. I was absorbing a vocabulary and a framework, and a way of thinking about power that was less elegant but more durable than anything I had encountered before. I also, in my sophomore year, made my first major strategic mistake. I want to tell you about this honestly because I think the mistake is important. I think it tells you something true about what happens to a person who has been carrying a grievance alone for a very long time. How the pressure of that isolation eventually finds a crack in the discipline and leaks out in ways that are not productive and are potentially damaging. There was a former classmate from high school, a person named Dustin, who had existed at the edge of Shane Bradford's social orbit in a way that had always seemed, to me, slightly more complicated than simple admiration. Dustin was perceptive in the way of smart people who have chosen to use their perceptiveness to manage social environments rather than challenge them. He had, on 2 or 3 occasions in our shared history, made remarks that suggested he was not entirely comfortable with the role he was playing in the dynamics around Shane Bradford. Remarks that were quickly covered and retracted in the way of things said and then regretted. In the spring of my sophomore year, I reached out to Dustin. We were both far from home, both in different schools in different cities, both old enough that the social hierarchies of high school should have felt like ancient history. I told myself the conversation would be informational, that I was simply trying to understand something I had never fully understood, but I pushed too hard. I was 19 years old, and I had been holding this information alone for 3 years, and the pressure of it was making me less careful than I needed to be. I asked 2 specific questions. I indicated, through the precision of my queries, that I had a framework that included things I shouldn't have had access to. Dustin withdrew from the conversation with the particular discomfort of someone who has just realized they've been asked to participate in something larger than they intended. He wasn't aggressive about it. He simply became unavailable, and I suspect, without being able to prove it, that some version of the conversation reached Shane Bradford through the social network that had survived from high school, because 2 months later, Warren called me in a way that was subtly different from his usual calls. The warmth was present, but there was something new underneath it. A watchfulness that I recognized because I had spent years learning to recognize it. He didn't say anything specific. He asked general questions, but the quality of his attention was sharper, more interested in certain directions in a way that communicated clearly that something had shifted. I had made myself visible before I was ready to be visible. The error cost me months of recalibration. I pulled back completely. I became, in every conversation with Warren, perfectly unremarkable. The functional, slightly distant adult son who was simply growing up and growing apart in the ordinary way. I gave him nothing to work with. I focused entirely on school, on building the professional and academic foundation I would need, and I waited for his watchfulness to relax. It did. Gradually, over the course of about 6 months, the specific quality of alertness I had detected in his calls faded back to its normal baseline. He was satisfied that I was simply the son who was going about his life. I graduated after 4 years with strong academic honors, a concentration in corporate finance, and 3 internships at firms that had taught me more about the mechanics of debt markets and corporate leverage than any classroom could have. The work was not glamorous. It was the kind of detailed, technical, document-heavy work that most people in finance consider a stepping stone to something more exciting. I considered it the foundation of the only thing that was going to matter. I took a position with a mid-size investment firm in a city on the East Coast. I told Warren it was a good opportunity. He said he was proud of me. I was 22 years old, 3 states away from where I'd grown up, and the picture was still incomplete. I knew the shape of the betrayal. Warren's direction of Shane Bradford's campaign against me, the motive of pushing me out to clear the path for something else. But I didn't know the full architecture. I didn't know the specifics of what Shane Bradford was to Warren beyond an apparently valued associate. I didn't know where I actually fit into the picture from Warren's perspective. What exactly he was afraid I would claim, or challenge, or complicate. I was patient with not knowing. I had learned to be patient with not knowing. And I continued to build. The investment firm placed me in its restructuring division, the part of the business that dealt with distressed companies, debt in default, businesses that were failing or had failed, or were in the complex and painful process of reorganizing under financial pressure. It was not the prestigious corner of finance. It was not the place that produced the headline deals or the magazine profiles or the professional prestige that other divisions generated. It was the part of the business that did the difficult, unglamorous, detail-intensive work of understanding why things had fallen apart and how they could be reassembled under different conditions. I loved it immediately, with a specificity that surprised me and that I quickly understood was not coincidental. Because restructuring, at its most fundamental, is about understanding power, the structure of it, the redistribution of it, what happens when it shifts from one set of hands to another. It is about learning to read the debt covenants and loan agreements and intercompany arrangements that constitute the actual skeleton of a business, not the visible surface of revenue and growth and the narrative that management presents to the world, but the underlying obligation structure that determines who actually controls what and when and under what conditions. I spent 5 years in that division. I became extremely good at it. I got good at reading a company's financial documents the way a physician reads imaging, looking past the surface presentation to the structural vulnerabilities, the places where the architecture was bearing more weight than it could sustain, the places where a precisely applied pressure could produce a specific and predictable result. In my 4th year at the firm, I partnered with a colleague named Philip on my first independent debt acquisition, a junior position in a regional retail company that had accumulated more debt than its cash flows could support. The position was cheap. We bought it, worked the restructuring process with patience and precision, and within 18 months had converted a distressed investment into a meaningful return. It was not a large transaction, but it taught me with a clarity and completeness that all the textbooks had gestured at without fully delivering, the fundamental lesson of the work. The purchase of debt is the purchase of power. When you own what someone owes, you have a claim on their future that no equity position can match. You don't need to own a company to control it. You need to own its obligations. I thought about that lesson in the specific way that you think about things that have application beyond their immediate context. My relationship with Warren during those years was the strangest of the entire story, I think. We maintained a regular pattern of communication, calls every few weeks, occasional visits that I managed to keep brief and procedural. He talked about the company with the ease of a man who has always navigated challenges and expects to continue to do so. He mentioned, with increasing frequency, the talented young executive who had joined the management team, a man who had shown a remarkable aptitude for the business, who was particularly effective in creditor and partner relationships, who had demonstrated a real instinct for the company's direction. He spoke about this person with a warmth that was different from his usual professional register. He mentioned the name once, in the context of a strategic hire, Shane Bradford. I kept my voice completely even. I said it sounded like Warren had found someone good. Warren said yes, he had, and we moved on to something else. I held that conversation for several days afterward, examining it from multiple angles, the way you examine something you found and are not yet sure how to classify. I turned 30 in a city far from where I grew up. I had not been back in 2 years. I ate dinner with colleagues who knew nothing about any of this, and I thought about what I needed to do next. By then, I had a clearer picture. I had been doing research, not dramatic, not in the style of a movie where the protagonist pulls all-nighters with a corkboard and red string. Systematic, patient, professional research. Public records, business filings, old newspaper archives accessible through university databases. Professional registrations and corporate documents that were technically public and practically invisible because nobody had thought to look for them. I had found traces of a woman named Colleen in the social and professional record of Warren's early career. A brief mention in a local business publication from about 30 years ago, a name on a corporate correspondence list, the kind of trace that appears when two professional lives briefly intersect and the intersection is not significant enough for anyone to notice except the two people whose lives it was, and the person looking for exactly that kind of trace many decades later. I had a hypothesis. The hypothesis was specific and architectural, but I didn't have the document that would confirm it, and without the document it was only a hypothesis. I returned to my hometown on a Tuesday in November of the year I turned 31. Consulting engagement with a local firm. Legitimate work, nothing fabricated. Hotel rather than Warren's house. I cited convenience. He accepted the explanation. He took me to dinner on the second evening and spent most of it describing the company's recent challenges. Market headwinds, contract difficulties, a debt load that had accumulated during 2 acquisition attempts that hadn't gone as planned. He spoke with the measured optimism of a man who has always believed in his own capacity to navigate whatever comes. He mentioned over dessert with the ease of an afterthought that Shane Bradford had been particularly valuable in navigating some of the more complex creditor conversations. He described the quality of this relationship with a warmth that, for the first time, he made no real effort to camouflage as purely professional. I said it sounded like Warren had the right person in place. Over my coffee cup, I looked at Warren once, and Warren looked back at me. And something passed between us that was not acknowledgement, and was not confrontation, but was something in between. The quality of a moment in which two people who both know something that neither of them has said, are briefly, silently, in the same space with that knowledge. He looked away first. I drove to the county records office the following morning. I spent most of that day and the following morning in the basement archive. I was patient with the work. I had been patient with many kinds of work over many years, and the work of combing through physical records for a specific document that may or may not exist is a particular kind of patience, slow and repetitive and easy to abandon if you don't have a reason to stay with it. I had a reason to stay with it. Near the bottom of a folder in the records of a dissolved corporate holding entity from Warren's earlier career, I found a document that had nothing to do with the corporate record it was filed with. It was a private investigator's report, dated about 23 years earlier, addressed to Warren at a private residential address. It was a background report on my mother, Lydia, the kind that a cautious, methodical man commissions before entering a significant personal relationship. The report described her history, her family, her circumstances. It noted, in the clinical and factual language of investigative reports, that she was pregnant at the time of the relationship. It named the biological father, a name I didn't recognize, a man who had been in her life briefly and was no longer. It described the circumstances of the pregnancy in the neutral tone of someone assembling facts rather than making judgments. And then, in a separate section, the investigator had noted something they had apparently found in the course of the broader investigation. Something they included because Warren had apparently asked them to look for it, or because the investigator had understood that it was relevant to the full picture Warren was trying to assemble. Warren already had a child, born approximately 2 years before his marriage to my mother. Born to a woman named Colleen, from a relationship that had been kept private, a son. The document included the name Shane Bradford. I set the report down very carefully on the records counter. I looked at the wall in front of me. I breathed. I picked it up and read it again. Shane Bradford was Warren's biological son. I was not. My mother had already been pregnant when she met Warren. Warren had married her anyway. The investigator's report, read carefully, suggested reasons. A business connection at the time, a public appearance to maintain, a scandal to manage. He had taken on a child that was not biologically his, and built a life that required, among other things, presenting that child to the world as his. But the biological son existed, the real son, from the earlier relationship, who had been kept private and secret and separate. And at some point that I would never be able to date precisely, but that I suspected had come early in my adolescence, perhaps even before I started high school, Warren had made a decision. He had decided what the future of his company was going to look like, and that future centered on his biological son, and the stepson who had come with the marriage was a complication in that future. Not a dangerous complication, not an immediate threat. I was too young, too unaware, too trusting to be any kind of immediate threat, but a potential complication, a future uncertainty, a claim that might eventually be made on the thing he was building. And Warren was a methodical, careful, forward-thinking businessman who had, for his entire professional life, eliminated potential complications before they became actual ones. The systematic social humiliation had not been random. It had not been the product of a disorganized cruelty. It had been a targeted campaign designed to produce a specific outcome, make the stepson feel so unwelcome, so diminished, so fundamentally unbelonging that he would leave, quietly, without drama, without ever understanding why he felt so out of place in the life he had been born into. And I had left, as intended, quietly and without a fight. I requested copies of the documents. I paid the fee. I folded the papers into my bag with the precise care of someone handling something that is both evidence and wound simultaneously. I walked out into the November air and stood on the sidewalk outside the records office for a while without moving. And then I made the decision that I had been building toward for 15 years without knowing exactly what it was. The research and the planning that followed the records office afternoon were the most intensive of my professional life, and they were conducted simultaneously with a life that appeared, from outside, to be simply the normal professional activity of a specialist in distressed debt. I had been tracking Warren's company for 2 years before that November. I knew the debt structure, the senior tranches, the junior tranches, the covenant conditions, the cash flow projections that underpin the existing arrangements. I knew where the vulnerabilities were. I knew which pieces of the debt were closest to market and most likely to move if the company's credit quality deteriorated further. I had been watching and waiting because I also knew that companies in the position Warren's was in, not in crisis but under pressure, with headwinds that were real and a debt load that had not been intended, tended to either stabilize or deteriorate on a predictable schedule. The deterioration came from a contract renewal that Warren had expected and that didn't materialize. A major logistics client had renegotiated its contract with a competitor, and the revenue impact was significant enough to push the company's debt covenants out of compliance. It was not immediately catastrophic, not the kind of crisis that produces bankruptcy filings within weeks, but it was the kind of crack that, if you have been watching the wall for long enough, you recognize as the beginning of something structural. Philip and I, through our fund, made our first acquisition quietly in the spring of the following year. Junior debt, the riskiest piece, furthest from recovery in a distress scenario, cheap because the major lenders were happy to be rid of it. We paid carefully calibrated amounts through an intermediary structure that made the beneficial ownership technically discoverable but practically invisible to anyone who wasn't specifically looking for it. We filed the required regulatory disclosures under the fund's name. My name was associated with the fund in the registration documents, but in the context of a distressed debt creditor group, it was one name among several, and not one that anyone at the company would have reason to investigate. Then we waited. The waiting stretched over months. Months during which I had monthly calls with Warren and gave him nothing, and attended to the debt market conditions and the company's financial disclosures, and managed a dozen other professional obligations that were real and legitimate and had nothing to do with any of this. Months during which I continued to build the professional capability and the financial position that made everything else possible. There were evenings in that period when the weight of it was almost physical, not the anger, as I had converted the anger to fuel years ago, burned it through the discipline of the professional work and the analytical exactness of the preparation, but something else, something that didn't have the clarity of anger and was harder to metabolize. The grief of a person who has been raised by someone and loved them, and is now in the process of systematically taking apart everything they built, even when what they built was built on a lie. Even when the dismantling is deserved and deliberate and strategically correct. You are still the child they raised, even when they raised you in bad faith, and the emotional residue of that childhood does not disappear simply because you have understood its true nature. I worked through it, or I worked around it. The distinction on most days felt academic. I found a partner in the creditor group, and then a second. Together, our position became a blocking position. Not the largest holders, but coordinated in a way that mattered when the restructuring process formalized and everyone came to the table needing a deal. The restructuring process took 8 months to complete. I will spare you the technical detail, because the technical detail is the mechanism, not the story. The story is simpler. By the end of 8 months, a comprehensive restructuring document had been negotiated and signed. The debt load was reduced. The company survived as a going concern. The major creditors received repayment on modified terms. And our group, the coordinated blocking position that had held the deal together, or held it apart depending on which side of us you were on, received an equity stake in the reorganized company and board representation. The terms were specific. The governance structure was specific. The management review process was specific. Everything proceeded as the documents required. I flew back to my hometown the week the deal closed. The hotel was the same one. The November air was the same. I ate dinner, alone, and thought about nothing in particular, and went to bed at a reasonable hour. In the morning I put on the suit I had bought specifically for that day and drove to the headquarters building. The lobby was familiar in the way that places from your past are familiar when you return to them as a different person, simultaneously unchanged and completely different, the change being entirely in the viewer rather than the viewed. I took the elevator to the executive floor. I was shown to the conference room. Warren and Shane Bradford were already there when I walked in. I want to describe this moment with precision, because I have replayed it so many times in my mind that I want to give you the accurate version rather than the one that has been edited by repetition. Warren was sitting at the far end of the conference table. He was older than I had last seen him in person, more lined, more careful in his movements, but composed in the way that he had always been composed, the way that takes genuine talent to maintain in all conditions. He looked up when I came in, and I watched his face go through a rapid internal process. Not shock. Warren didn't do shock. Something more controlled than shock, more managed, and because of the management, more revealing. Shane Bradford was sitting to Warren's left. He had aged well, with the particular quality of preservation that comes from a life of access to everything you need. He was polished and contained. He looked at me with a recognition that shifted in the space of 3 or 4 seconds through several distinct registers. Casual social recognition, something more specific that I couldn't immediately name, and then something that settled into discomfort of the non-performed variety, the kind that happens in your face before you've had a chance to decide how to manage it. I set my bag down. I sat across the table from them. I placed my folder on the table and rested my hands on it lightly without opening it. Warren said, "I wasn't expecting you personally. I thought this one deserved a personal touch," I said. A silence, not a long silence, 10, 15 seconds, but a quality to it that was different from ordinary professional silence. I opened the folder. I placed the executed restructuring document in front of them. the final version, with all signatures, with the board composition schedule, and the governance provisions attached. "You've reviewed all of this with your legal team," I said. "Everything is in order. I just wanted to be here for the closing." Warren looked at the document. He looked at me. He said quietly and without a great deal of inflection, "When did you—" "The first position was approximately 4 years ago," I said. "The blocking coordination came together in the spring." Another silence. Shane Bradford said nothing. He was sitting very still with his jaw set in a way that was doing exactly what jaws do when the person they belong to is managing something that would otherwise be visible. "You've done well," Warren said. The words landed flat. Not as a compliment, not as a reproach, as a statement of fact from a man who had been confronted by a fact. "I have," I said. He was quiet, and then, "I didn't want a scandal." I had known for years that if we ever got to this moment, he would say something like that. I had composed my response many times in my imagination. Versions that were devastating, versions that were cold and surgical, versions that captured in one sentence the entire architecture of what he had done and what it had cost. I had imagined this conversation with the precision and completeness that comes from living with a thing for 20 years. Sitting there, in that conference room, looking at a man who was smaller than I remembered and older than I remembered, and no longer the center of gravity that he had been in every room I had ever shared with him. Sitting there, I didn't want the devastating version. The devastating version was for the person I had been at 16. This version was for the person I was now. I said, "You just wanted me to disappear." He didn't answer. The document on the table was the answer. The document was the entire answer, and it had taken 2 decades to draft. I looked at Shane Bradford. He was looking back at me with an expression I had not expected. Not defiance. Not the particular composed challenge that I remembered from those years of high school. Something genuine, something involuntary, something that read as shame. Not the performed shame of someone who has been caught, but the real kind, the kind that happens in a person's face before they've decided how to frame it. I had planned for a very long time to say something to him directly, something that would land, something that would crystallize, for him, the shape of what he had participated in and what it had produced. I had composed those words with the same care I had brought to everything else. But sitting there, looking at him, I understood something I had not previously understood clearly. He had been a child when it started. He had been given instructions by a man he presumably loved, at an age when the cognitive and moral tools to fully evaluate those instructions were not yet developed. He had grown up shaped by those instructions, built into a person who was the product of Warren's plan, the same way I had been, just in a different direction. He had been the chosen one and I had been the discarded one, and both of us had been managed by the same person toward ends that neither of us had fully chosen. That doesn't excuse him. I want to be precise about that. It doesn't excuse him. He made choices as an adult. He participated in things as an adult. He could have chosen otherwise. But I could also see in his face at that moment that he was aware of all of that he was sitting with all of it, and the sight of it did something unexpected to the particular sentence I had been saving for that moment. It made it seem like something for the person I had been, rather than the person I was. I said nothing to him. I picked up my folder. I told Warren that the legal team would send the board meeting calendar invitations. I said I expected the transition to proceed according to the timeline in the documents. I stood up. Warren looked up from the table. His face had the quality of a man who has arrived at a destination he believed he was building toward for 30 years and found, standing in it, that someone else had gotten there first. I walked to the door. I stopped with my hand on the handle, for a moment that I allowed to be exactly as long as it was. Then I opened the door and walked through it. The elevator was empty. The lobby was full of ordinary people having an ordinary morning. I walked through the glass doors and into the November air and stood on the sidewalk and breathed. I had been waiting for this to feel like something specific. Victory, maybe, or vindication, or the particular relief that comes when you have set something down that you have been carrying for a very long time. I had imagined those feelings so many times, from so many angles, that I felt I knew exactly what they were going to feel like. They didn't feel like that. What it felt like was the end of a sentence that had been running for 20 years. The particular quality of a pause that contains the full weight of everything that preceded it. Not triumph, not relief. Something quieter and more permanent than either. The specific feeling of a thing that has been completed. I had won. And I knew, standing on that sidewalk with the cold November air on my face, that I was not the same person who had needed to win. That the distance between those two people was real and wide and crossed at significant cost. I called Philip from the car, told him the closing had gone smoothly. He said good, he'd see me Thursday. I drove to the airport. While I was waiting to board, my mother called. She had heard something, a reference in a local context to restructuring news at Warren's company. She wanted to make sure I was all right. Her voice had the careful quality it always had, the quality of a person navigating around something that takes up a great deal of space in a room. I told her I was fine. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said very quietly, "I always hoped you'd be okay. I knew things were complicated, more complicated than you understood." I asked her what she meant. She was quiet for a long time. I didn't know how to... She stopped, started again. "I just hoped you'd come out of it okay." I thought about asking her more, about the investigator's report, about what she had known and when she had known it, about whether the careful quality I had attributed to restraint had been something else entirely. Guilt, maybe, or fear, or the particular paralysis of a person who made a decision under pressure that they have spent decades trying not to examine too closely. I didn't ask, not then. The conversation I would eventually need to have with my mother was a different conversation from the one I had just had, requiring a different kind of presence and a different kind of openness than I had access to on the concourse of an airport on the afternoon I had just had. I told her I was okay. I was on my way home. I'd call her soon. I boarded the plane. In the months after the transaction closed, I received 2 communications that I want to tell you about. The first was from Warren, an actual letter, handwritten, sent to my office. The penmanship was elegant. He had always had elegant handwriting. The letter was several pages long and read like the document of a man who has spent a very long time composing something he has never been able to say out loud. He explained. He did not exactly apologize. I want to be careful about that characterization, because it would misrepresent the document. He explained. He laid out the circumstances of his marriage to my mother, the pregnancy, the business connection, the public appearance, the reputational calculation. He described the existence of Shane Bradford and the history of that relationship and the way he had understood, as the company grew and as the question of its future became more concrete, that he had to make a choice about what its future was going to look like. He said the choice had been about the company and about what he felt he owed to his biological son, and that it had not, in his framing, been primarily about me. He said he had tried to handle it in a way that was, and this was the phrase he used, minimally harmful. He said he hoped I would eventually understand, if not forgive. The letter was a remarkable document. It was the work of someone who had thought about this very carefully for a very long time, and who had arrived at a narrative of events that was coherent and internally consistent, and positioned him, even in defeat, as a man who had faced an impossible situation and made pragmatic choices rather than a man who had deliberately harmed someone who trusted him. I read it twice. I put it in a file. I did not respond. The second communication was a text message from Shane Bradford. Long, carefully worded, sent from a number I recognized from the restructuring correspondence. He said he had wanted to reach out for a long time. He said he had done things in his life that he was not proud of. He said he had been young when it started and had not fully understood what he was participating in, and then later had understood but had felt by then too embedded to know how to change course. He said he wasn't asking for anything. He just needed me to know. I read that message 3 times. I held it for a week. What he said about being young was true, or at least partially true. What he said about not fully understanding was at least partially accurate. The things Warren had set in motion had shaped him the way they had shaped me, just in opposite directions. What he described about being too far in to know how to get out, I understood that in a way that was more uncomfortable than I had expected, because I had also been inside something for decades. I had also organized my life around a goal that had, at moments, felt as much like a trap as a plan. I had also, on more than one occasion, felt the specific impossibility of changing course because the course had become structural. I thought about responding for a full week. I sat with it the way I had learned to sit with things, without rushing toward a resolution, giving it the full weight of real consideration. I did not respond, not because I was certain it was the wrong decision, but because I was honest with myself about what responding would have required, and I didn't have it. The genuine openness that a real response would have demanded, the willingness to engage with the history between us in a way that acknowledged complexity and allowed for something other than the architecture of the long conflict. I couldn't access that, not yet, maybe not for a long time. I'd become, through 20 years of careful and deliberate and costly work, someone who was very good at certain things and genuinely limited in certain others. The limitation was real. I was not going to pretend otherwise. The company went through its transition on the timeline specified in the documents. The management review concluded as the governance provisions required it to conclude. The transition period for Warren's ceremonial role completed 18 months after closing, cleanly and finally. I did not attend any of the transition events. I had other things to attend to. I want to tell you something about what came after, about the period following the transaction that I have spent almost no time talking about in any context because it doesn't fit the narrative shape that this story has in most of the ways people tell it. The after is complicated. I expected it to be a beginning, a clearing, a space that would become available for a different kind of living, now that the long occupation of the preparation was complete. And in some ways it was that. The specific weight of the 20-year project lifted, gradually, in the months after the transaction. I was less occupied, less oriented toward a distant goal, less structured around the discipline of patient, strategic accumulation toward a specific end. What I found underneath that weight, when it lifted, was a person who was not entirely sure what he was for without it. I had built, over 2 decades, a very specific set of capacities. I was analytically precise in ways that were professionally valuable. I was patient with complex, long-horizon problems in ways that produced results. I was disciplined about information, about what I showed people, what I told people, what I allowed to be visible, and what I kept private. I was very good, in short, at the things that the 20 years had required me to be good at. What I was less good at was the things the 20 years had required me to set aside. A colleague, someone I had worked closely with for several years, someone I would call a friend even though the word felt slightly foreign when I applied it to myself, said something to me once that I have thought about regularly since. She said, "You know what I notice about you? You're very patient with things and not very patient with people." She said it with the matter-of-fact directness of a genuinely perceptive person who has decided you can handle the truth. She was exactly right. I had learned patience as a strategic capacity oriented toward outcomes, toward processes and timelines and the slow accumulation of position. But people are not processes, and the kind of patience that works in a professional context does not translate automatically into the kind that makes relationships feel natural and safe and worth opening yourself to. I had also learned, at very deep levels, to manage my presentation, to control what was visible and what wasn't, to maintain the surface while something different was happening underneath. These skills had kept me functional and eventually productive across 20 years of carrying something that could have broken me. But the same skills, in a different context. In the context of trying to be genuinely present with another person, trying to be in a relationship that isn't fundamentally strategic, these skills become obstacles. You can be so good at managing what you show that you lose track of what you actually feel. You can be so accustomed to strategic patience that ordinary human impatience, the instinctive, impulsive responsiveness that makes connection feel immediate, atrophies. I'm working on it. That is the most accurate thing I can say. I am working on it with the same deliberateness I brought to everything else, which is perhaps the wrong approach and possibly the only approach I know. I'm working on the understanding that winning the thing I needed to win did not automatically produce the person I wanted to be on the other side of it. That process, the rebuilding, the genuine rebuilding of the parts that the long work had calcified, is slower and less structured and harder to measure than anything I did in the 20 years before. I think about the boy in the hallway, the 16-year-old standing very still on thick carpet outside a closed door, listening to something that broke his world open and making, in that moment of breaking, a decision that would shape the rest of his life. I think about what that decision cost him, not what it produced, not the 20 years of discipline and patience and professional accumulation and the final decisive transaction. What it cost the person inside those years, the ordinary, human things that were foregone or deferred or slowly calcified in the service of the long plan. He deserved better. He deserved a father who was simply a father. He deserved to be a kid in a high school who was simply a kid, going through the normal and manageable difficulties of that environment without the specific, engineered, systematic cruelty that had been designed to make him feel so unwelcome in his own life that he would disappear from it. He didn't get that. He got something different. He got the machine, and the machine shaped him. And when he finally took the machine apart, he found that it had left an imprint on him that looked like capability and felt like limitation, simultaneously and permanently. I won. I'm clear about that. What I built and what I did was real and earned and took everything I had for 2 decades. The man who sat across from Warren Hargrove in that conference room was not the boy the machine was designed to discard. The machine failed, but I am also aware every day of what the winning cost, of the specific shape that 2 decades of patient strategic investment leaves in a person, of the things I am not naturally good at now, that I might have been good at if the machine had never been built. That awareness is not regret. It is something more precise than regret. It is the accounting, the honest, unsentimental accounting of what was exchanged for what was given in order to build what was built. I made those exchanges willingly. I would make them again with the same information I had then. I am not asking for sympathy about the cost, and I am not claiming the cost was unjust. It was the cost of the specific thing I chose to do. I'm telling you about it, because I think this is the part of the story that almost never gets told, the part where the person who won has to figure out what winning means in the ordinary hours and days of a life that is no longer organized around the winning. Put it in the comments. I want to hear what you think about that. Not what you would have done differently. I've thought about that question from every angle, and I don't know the answer, and I'm not sure the answer exists. But what you think winning costs in the long run. Whether you think there's a version of this where the person comes out clean on the other side. Whether you think the 20 years of patience and strategic accumulation and careful, deliberate, completely controlled work toward a single outcome is something a person can do without being permanently changed by it. I don't know the answer. I live with the question. Warren Hargrove is in a house with his name on a building he no longer controls. The company exists and functions. The name is still on the building because changing it was not part of what I needed. Shane Bradford is in the process of figuring out who he is without the structural support of a father who was grooming him for a specific role in a specific future. That process is his own, and I have no particular feeling about it one way or another. I am in my city. I do my work. I have the colleague who tells me true things in a matter-of-fact voice, and I find that I value that more than I can easily articulate. I read biographies, histories, still, because some habits persist, and some of them should. And occasionally, in the specific quiet of an evening, when the day has been ordinary and uncomplicated, and there is nothing particular pressing for attention, I find myself sitting with the memory of a Wednesday in late April and a hallway, and the sound of two voices and a 16-year-old boy making a decision in the dark. He made the right decision, I think, the only decision that could have led somewhere other than permanent defeat. He made it at an enormous personal cost and without any guarantee that it would produce what it eventually produced, and he held it for 20 years without breaking. That is the thing I respect most about him, looking back. Not the transaction, not the patience, though the patience was real. The holding, the sustained, costly, daily holding of something that should have been spoken and was not spoken, because the speaking would have cost more than the silence. He held it. And then, at the right time, in the right room, with the right documents on the right table, he set it down and walked out of the door. That's the whole story. Take care of yourselves out there. And if you're in the middle of something, if you're 16 or 22 or 30, and you're carrying something that feels too heavy and too complicated and too long-term to believe you can hold it, I want you to know that patience is not the same as passivity, that discipline is not the same as paralysis, that the slow, quiet, unglamorous work of building a position from nothing is real work and it produces real results. And the cost is real too. Don't let anyone tell you it isn't. The cost is always real. Hold your head up. There are things I left out of the main telling that I want to come back to, because I think they matter. The story as I've told it has a shape, a long arc from the beginning to the end. But within that arc, there are stretches of time that I've compressed or skipped past, and those stretches contain truths that don't fit neatly into the forward momentum of the narrative, but that are real, and that changed me, and that deserve to be said. Let me tell you about the year I turned 26. I was 3 years into the restructuring job. I had the work, I was good at the work, I was getting better at the work, and the work had the quality of genuine absorption that I had been looking for since leaving home. A professional environment where the specific shape of my mind was actually useful, rather than something to be managed or apologized for. But I was also deeply alone in a way that I hadn't fully reckoned with yet. Not in the dramatic, cinematic sense of lonely. In the quieter, more ordinary sense of a person who has not yet built the infrastructure of adult friendship, because the majority of his social energy for the better part of a decade has been oriented toward a single private project that he can discuss with no one. You can't explain to a new colleague at a dinner party, in the way that people explain their lives to each other over wine, the actual thing that is organizing your interior life. You can tell them the professional story, the firm, the deals, the skill set being built. You can tell them the biographical surface, the hometown you left, the university you attended, the general outline of a life that is pleasant to hear without revealing much. But the actual center of your life is inaccessible in those conversations, and when the center of your life is inaccessible, conversations have a particular texture, warm enough on the surface, hollow underneath, that over time produces a specific kind of fatigue. I was 26, and I was fatigued in that way. Not desperate, not depressed in any clinical sense, just tired of the surface in a way that the surface could not relieve. There was a woman at the firm. Her name was Heather. She worked in the legal team. She was smart in the way that makes smart people interesting in social situations rather than exhausting, and we had what I would describe as a 3-month experiment in being closer than colleagues. It was not a romance exactly, though it had some of the texture of one. It was more like two people who recognized something in each other, a similar quality of reserve, a similar irony about the professional world they inhabited, a similar instinct to find the precise absurdity in things, and who tried, for a period of time, to see if that recognition could support something more sustained. It couldn't, or I couldn't let it. I was too careful. I was too practiced at managing what I showed. too attuned to the risk of giving someone else access to the interior that I had been protecting so rigorously for so long. She was kind about it when the experiment wound down. She said I was one of the most interesting people she knew, and one of the most unreachable, and she hoped that would change eventually. She was not unkind, she was just accurate. I thought about that observation for a long time. I filed it next to the 120 pages of memory on my hard drive, and I continued building. The professional work continued, the building continued, and I want to describe, in more detail than I've given it, the specific texture of that building because I think people who hear a story like mine often imagine the rebuilding phase as dramatic and forward-moving in a way that it is not, and the gap between the imagined version and the real version is where most people underestimate what the long game actually requires. The building was repetitive. It was daily and repetitive and largely unglamorous in its moment-to-moment reality. It was arriving early to an office and spending the first 3 hours reading documents that described the financial structure of companies that were in distress. It was the acquisition of a specific vocabulary, the language of debt covenants and intercreditor agreements and priority claims and subordination provisions that most people in the world have never encountered, and that is, in its actual content, not interesting to anyone who is not using it professionally. It was late evenings with financial models and early mornings with legal documents and the patient. Systematic accumulation of a competence that would eventually matter in a very specific context. I want to be honest with you about something. There were months, stretches of months, not days, when the whole project felt hollow, when the distance between where I was and where I needed to be was so large, and the pace of progress was so incremental, and the outcome was so remote in time and so uncertain in its ultimate form that sitting with it felt not like patience but like delusion, like the kind of thing a person tells themselves in order to avoid admitting that they have organized their life around a fantasy that is never going to resolve. I had those months. I had probably 12 to 18 months total, scattered across the years between 22 and 30, when the doubt was louder than the plan, when I considered the alternative, setting all of it down, going to therapy or going home and having the conversation with Warren that I had been avoiding for years, or simply moving on in the clean and clear way that people mean when they say that phrase, and that almost never means anything as simple as the phrase implies. I never seriously pursued any of those alternatives. Not because the doubt wasn't real. It was real. I'm not going to perform for you the version of this story where the protagonist is always certain, but because the alternative felt, to me, worse than the difficulty of staying, not emotionally worse, necessarily, strategically worse. I had an incomplete account of what had been done to me and why, and I had the fragment of a plan for what I was going to do about it, and setting those things down before the account was complete and the plan was executable would have meant living the rest of my life inside the question without ever reaching the answer. I could not tolerate that, not because I needed revenge in some melodramatic sense. I want to be precise about this, because I think the word revenge carries connotations that don't accurately describe what I was after. I needed resolution. I needed the truth to be complete and the account to be settled. I needed, in the most fundamental sense, to not be the person who left and never came back because being back would be too complicated. I needed to come back. On my own terms, with my own leverage, in my own time. That need kept me in the work on the dark months. The need for resolution, not revenge. Although, I will be honest, the line between those two things is not as clean as I used to think it was. Let me tell you about Philip, because he deserves more than the passing mention I gave him earlier. Philip Whitmore had joined the restructuring firm the year before I did, and he was the first person in my professional life who seemed to understand, without being told, that the work was not just work for me. He never said anything about it directly. Philip was not a person who spoke about things he observed unless asked, which was one of the many things I respected about him. But there was a quality to his partnership across the years we worked together that had the texture of a person who is giving the other person room for something they are carrying without naming what the thing is. He was meticulous in a way that complemented, rather than duplicated, my own approach. I saw the structural vulnerabilities, he saw the execution risks. I was willing to stay with an uncertain position long past the point where most investors would have moved on. He made sure we had the documentation and the defensive positioning to survive the waiting period with minimal exposure. He trusted my analysis in a way that was not blind. He challenged it regularly, and the challenges made it better. But that was also consistent and substantial enough to build a real professional foundation on. When we formed our independent practice, it was Philip who handled most of the relationship maintenance with the other creditors in the Warren Hargrove situation. I had to stay in the background for longer than was comfortable, because the optics of my involvement, if it became visible too early, would have complicated the creditor coordination in ways that could have derailed the blocking position entirely. Philip understood this without being given the full explanation, and he managed it with exactly the discretion the situation required. I never fully explained the personal history to him. I gave him enough of an outline that he could make sense of my particular investment thesis on the company, and he accepted that outline without pressing for the rest. I'm aware that I owe him more than a transaction. I'm less good at settling that kind of debt than I was at settling the other kind. The creditor coordination phase was a period of professional intensity unlike anything I had experienced before, and I have experienced a great deal of professional intensity. We were managing relationships with multiple parties who had overlapping but non-identical interests, each of whom was conducting their own analysis of the company's situation, each of whom had their own timeline pressures and their own leverage calculations. The complexity of maintaining a coordinated blocking position across that environment, keeping everyone aligned on the essential conditions while accommodating the individual concerns that each creditor brought to the table, was the most technically demanding thing I had done in my career. It was also, if I'm honest, exhilarating in a way that I found slightly uncomfortable to acknowledge. There is a particular quality to working on a problem that has every dimension you're capable of addressing: professional, personal, analytical, strategic, patience testing, simultaneously. It is a quality I have not found elsewhere in anything like the same intensity. The work was real, the stakes were real, and the outcome was going to be, in one direction or another, complete and irreversible. I don't have many memories from that period that are not about the work itself. I was in the office early. I was at the work late. I read the company's financial filings the way other people read novels, looking for the emotional truth underneath the official narrative, the places where the story being presented diverged from the story the numbers were actually telling. Warren's company was a well-run business in a difficult environment, and the people running it were not incompetent. But the debt structure was a trap they had constructed for themselves, and the contract renewal failure had removed the one variable that might have given them enough runway to escape it. I remember a specific evening about 4 months before the closing, sitting at my desk at 9 o'clock at night with the company's 3-year cash flow projection on one screen and a creditor group term sheet on the other screen, and having a moment of absolute clarity about the outcome. Not certainty. Nothing in this work is ever certain, but a level of structural clarity that amounted to a very high confidence assessment. The deal was going to close on terms that our group could live with. The governance provisions were going to be what they needed to be. The management review timeline was going to be exactly as specified. I sat with that clarity for a while, and then I thought about a boy in a high school cafeteria, eating lunch alone because the ambient social signal had been carefully tuned to make him invisible. I thought about a conversation in a hallway on a Wednesday in April. I thought about 20 years of patient, deliberate, unglamorous accumulation. And then I finished the term sheet analysis and sent it to Philip and went home. I want to tell you about a conversation I had with my mother, about 3 months after the closing. We had spoken briefly on the day of the closing, and I had heard in her voice the careful quality that I had spent years decoding, and I had not had the capacity to go further into it that day. But 3 months later, I flew back to see her. Not to Warren's house, because Warren and Lydia had separated by then. A development that I had neither anticipated nor arranged, but that, in retrospect, was the kind of thing that tends to happen when the foundation of an arrangement has been decisively altered. She was living in a smaller house on the east side of the city. She had a kitchen garden and a reading chair by the window, and a quietness that seemed, for the first time in my memory, to be something other than controlled. It looked, from a certain angle, like relief. We sat at her kitchen table and she made coffee, and for a while we didn't talk about anything significant. We talked about her garden and my work and the weather and the small things that people who have years of careful management between them talk about when they are trying to find the ground beneath all of it. And then she said, without particular lead-up, "I need to tell you something. I think I've needed to tell you for a long time." I told her she didn't have to. She said she did. She said she had known, when I was still a child, that something was wrong in the dynamic between Warren and me. Not the full truth. She didn't know the full truth for a long time. But she had known that what Warren told her and what was actually happening didn't align, in the specific way that certain things don't align when a person is being managed by someone who is better at management than they are. She said she had told herself it was simply the difficulty of a blended family. She had told herself that Warren's distance from me was the normal emotional complexity of a man who had taken on another person's child. She had told herself that the social difficulties at school were the normal difficulties of adolescence. She had told herself many things over many years, because the alternative, acknowledging what she was actually seeing, would have required her to act in ways that felt impossible given the circumstances she was in. She said, "I was a coward. I'm not asking you to tell me I wasn't." I sat with that for a while. I thought about what to say. I said, "I know." Not as an accusation, as a statement of fact, delivered without anger, which I had expected to feel and didn't, which surprised me. She asked if I could forgive her eventually. I told her I thought forgiveness was the wrong frame. I told her I didn't hold it the way she seemed to be expecting me to hold it. That the anger I had, and I had plenty of anger over the years, had been oriented toward Warren and toward the structure of what he had done, not toward her. That I understood, in the way of an adult who has navigated enough of his own moral complexity to avoid judging others too precisely from the outside, that people make choices in constrained circumstances that they might not make in unconstraining ones, and that her circumstances had been genuinely constraining. She cried, briefly. The controlled cry of someone who doesn't often allow it. We sat in her kitchen for 2 more hours and talked about things we had never talked about before. And some of those things were painful, and some of them were simply true. And by the end of them, I felt something I had not expected to feel in that house, in that conversation with that person. The specific, unfamiliar lightness of something that has been set down after being carried for a very long time. Not healed. I want to be precise about that. Not healed, not resolved, not wrapped up. Just set down. A thing I had been holding with some part of my attention for 20 years, placed on a table and left there. It was, in its modest way, its own kind of closing. I see my mother regularly now. The relationship is easier than it has ever been, not because the history doesn't exist, but because the history has been acknowledged in a way that allows it to be history rather than a current condition. She has a life that appears to be genuinely her own, which I don't think was true before. I don't know what she feels about Warren, and I don't ask. That is hers to carry. There's a question I've been asked, in the few contexts where I've talked about any version of this story, that I want to address directly because I think it deserves a direct answer. The question is, was it worth it? I don't think I'm the right person to answer that question. I'm too close to it. I'm too inside the specific shape of what it cost and what it produced. But I can tell you what the question actually contains, because I think the way people frame it usually misses the real question. The real question is not whether the transaction was worth it. The transaction was a business outcome with a very specific professional value. The real question is whether 20 years of organizing a significant portion of your interior life around a single goal, at the cost of many of the ordinary human things that make life habitable on a day-to-day basis, is a reasonable trade for the particular form of resolution that I eventually achieved. I don't know. I genuinely don't know. I can construct arguments in both directions, and both arguments contain real things. The case for yes. The resolution was complete. The truth was faced. The machine was dismantled. The person who was supposed to disappear did not disappear, and in fact dismantled the thing that was trying to make him disappear. The case for no. The 20 years were 20 years, and in 20 years a person can build a life, build relationships, build a self that is oriented toward the living rather than the settling. And the settling, when it came, did not produce the person who had been deferred. It produced the person who had been formed by the deferral. Both of those things are true. I live in both of them simultaneously. I want to tell you one more thing. Something I've thought about more recently than the rest. Something that sits differently from the tactical and strategic and professional elements of this story. Shane Bradford reached out again, about 8 months after his first text message, which I had not answered. He sent a second one, shorter than the first, that said simply, "I still think about this. I understand if you don't want contact. I just want you to know that I do." I read it the day it arrived. I read it several more times over the following days, and I thought very carefully about what it would mean to respond. I want to be honest with you about the feeling. There was something in that message, the second one, that got past the outer layer in a way the first one hadn't. Maybe because it was shorter and less constructed. Maybe because the months between the two had given me some amount of the distance I had been unable to access before. Maybe because the particular phrasing, "I understand if you don't want contact," was the kind of statement that doesn't ask for anything, and therefore makes it more possible to consider giving something. I wrote a response. I wrote 3 or 4 drafts of a response, actually, across a period of 2 days. The drafts ranged widely, from very brief acknowledgement to something more substantial, something that engaged with what he'd said in a way that was genuine rather than simply procedural. I didn't send any of them. I filed them in a folder that I look at occasionally without clear purpose, and I continue to think about the question that they represent, what it would mean and what it would cost and what it might produce, to be in a conversation with a person who is as much a product of the machine as I am, but in entirely different ways. I don't know the answer to that question yet either. I'm letting it sit. I've gotten better, over the past few years, at letting things sit without immediately reaching for resolution, and I consider that a form of progress, even if the progress is small and slow. Maybe I'll reach out. Maybe I won't. Maybe the question will resolve on its own, or change its shape over time, or become something entirely different from what it seems to be now. I've been wrong before about what something was, for long enough that I should have figured out how to be patient with not knowing. The company is a going concern. It functions, smaller and leaner than it was, with a management structure that is competent and unsentimental, and has no particular relationship to the personal history I've described. It is a business among businesses, operating in an ordinary way in an ordinary market. The name is still on the building, though the meaning of the name has changed, as meanings always change when the person who built them into a word has been removed from it. Sometimes I drive past the building when I'm in my hometown. Not often, maybe twice a year when I visit my mother. I don't stop. I don't slow down significantly. I just pass it at the speed of ordinary traffic, and for a moment I see it, and then I've passed it, and there's something else to look at. I'm not sure what I feel in those moments. Something. Not triumph. I moved past triumph a long time ago, and to be honest, I'm not sure I ever truly felt it in the pure form. Something more like acknowledgement, like the specific quality of attention you pay to something that was once very large in your life and is now simply a building on a street, which it has always also been, beneath the significance that history attached to it. Just a building, just a name, Just the place where a boy once heard a conversation he was never supposed to hear, and decided in the silence after what he was going to do about it. He did it, and then he went home. Thank you for staying with me through all of this. Genuinely, this is not a story that was easy to tell, and the fact that you're still here at the end of it means something. If any part of this resonated with you, if you're going through something that has this kind of shape, something long and complicated and organized around a truth that you can't yet use, I want you to know that the patience is real. The work is real. The outcome is possible. The cost is real too. I won't pretend otherwise. Put it in the comments. All of it. What you took away, what you would have done differently. Whether you think the person on the other side of 20 years of this is still the person who started it, or whether you think they're someone new entirely. I've been asking myself that question for years, and I still don't have a complete answer, and I'm interested in what you see from outside. Take care of yourselves, and whatever you're carrying, whatever the specific weight of whatever your version of this is, hold your head up. Just make sure it's pointed in the direction you actually want to go. I want to come back to one more thing, because I've been telling this story in a linear way, and the linear way is not entirely honest. The truth is that the years between high school and the transaction were not a clean progression. They were not a montage of discipline and sacrifice and gradual ascent. They were a human life, which means they were full of the ordinary failures and the ordinary joys and the ordinary stretches of time where nothing significant happened in any direction, and you had to find reasons to keep going that were not connected to the big arc of the thing. I had years that were genuinely good. I want to be clear about that. Not every year between 17 and 33 was organized around the grief and the long plan. There were years. Specifically, I think about a stretch of about 3 years in my late 20s when the professional work was going well, and I had enough distance from my hometown to not feel its specific gravity every waking hour. There were years when I was genuinely, ordinarily content, when I cooked dinner and read books and had conversations over drinks that had nothing to do with Warren or Shane or the machine or any of it. I had those years. They were real. I don't want to perform a version of this story where the protagonist exists in perpetual darkness and isolation, because that would be false and also, I think, less useful to you than the true version, which is that a person can carry something very heavy and still have a life around it. The two things coexist. They coexist in uncomfortable ways sometimes, in the sense that the ordinary goodness of an ordinary evening can feel slightly surreal when you are also, in the back of your mind, carrying the full weight of what you're carrying. But they coexist. I want to also tell you about a period that I've glossed over, which is the 3 years between the moment I found the investigator's report in the county records office and the moment I made the first debt acquisition. That period was, in some ways, the most difficult of the entire preparation, because it was the period in which I had the complete picture and had not yet begun to act on it. And the space between complete knowledge and the beginning of action is a very specific kind of difficulty. When I found that document, when I read the investigator's report and understood, in the full clarity of documentary evidence rather than the partial clarity of hypothesis, that I was not Warren's biological son and that Shane Bradford was, and that the entire architecture of my childhood humiliation had been deliberate. When I read that, I thought the clarity would be galvanizing. I thought that having the complete picture would immediately translate into movement, into action, into the beginning of the resolution. It didn't. What it did, for the first few months after, was destabilize me in ways I hadn't expected, because the complete picture included things that the hypothesis had not fully prepared me for. The hypothesis had included the betrayal. I had known about the betrayal, in its broad strokes, for 15 years. What the document added was the specific detail of my own origins, which I had never questioned because I had never had reason to, and which now required me to re-understand not just the betrayal, but myself. I was not the biological son of the man who raised me. I had a biological father whom I had never known, who had died before I was old enough to have any memory of him, leaving behind no trace in my life except the biological one. I was the child of a woman who had made a decision, under pressure and in complicated circumstances, to build a life with a man who had agreed to raise me for reasons that had nothing to do with love. I had known, on some level for 15 years, that I was not wanted in the way I had believed I was wanted. But there is a difference between knowing that abstractly and knowing the specific, documented truth of your own origins, which is that the life you believed was yours by right of birth was yours by the terms of a business arrangement that you were never meant to find out about. That took time to metabolize. Not weeks, months, possibly closer to a year. I went about my professional life and I held that knowledge, and I waited for it to settle into a form that I could work with rather than a form that was primarily disorienting. When it settled into something clear and specific. It settled into, the people who owe you the truth don't always owe you the love, and the people who owe you the love don't always have the capacity to deliver it. These are different obligations in different categories, and conflating them is one of the most expensive mistakes a person can make. Warren owed me truth. He owed it for 17 years of calling himself my father while engineering my departure. He owed it for every conversation in his study where I handed him my wounds, and he used them as fuel. He owed it for the investigator's report and the business arrangement, and the decision that I was a complication rather than a child. What he did not owe me, because it was not something he had ever had, was love. He had performed it. The performance was technically accomplished, but a performance of love is not the thing itself, and grieving the performance as if it were the thing is an expensive mistake. I had been making that mistake, in some form, for 15 years. The investigator's report ended the mistake by ending the ambiguity. I filed it, and I waited. And when the waiting became readiness, when the professional position and the financial position and the strategic clarity were all simultaneously sufficient, I acted. I've also never talked about what happened with Warren in the period between my visit to the records office and the final transaction. We continued our monthly calls. We continued the performance of a father and son who had simply grown apart in the ordinary way. I had become, by that point, so skilled at that particular performance that it produced almost no effort. The words came automatically. The emotional register was appropriate. The surface was indistinguishable from genuine estrangement rather than the specific and structured estrangement of a person who has decided to let the machine run its course while preparing in parallel to take it apart. There was one call about a year before the closing that I think about more than the others. Warren sounded tired, not in the way he sometimes sounded tired at the end of a long quarter, which was a tiredness that still had energy underneath it. The tiredness of someone who has been working hard at something they intend to continue working hard at. This was different. This was the tiredness of someone for whom the effort of maintaining the surface had begun to be more expensive than he could easily afford. He talked for a while about the company. He talked about the management team and the creditor conversations and the strategic challenges. And then, in a pause that lasted slightly longer than his pauses usually lasted, he said, "I've been thinking about you lately, about whether I did right by you." I held the phone very still. I kept my voice exactly even. "What do you mean?" I said. Another pause, and then he said, "I wonder sometimes if I was as present as I should have been. When you were growing up, whether I gave you enough of my attention." I said something non-committal, something about it being normal for fathers and sons to have distance, especially as sons get older. Something that was technically true and gave nothing away. He said, "You turned out well. Whatever else I got wrong, you turned out well." I thanked him. I asked about the company. We talked for another 10 minutes about ordinary things, and then said goodbye. I sat with that call for a while afterward. There was a version of that moment. The version where I didn't know what I knew, where the full picture hadn't been assembled, in which those words might have landed as something genuine. Might have been a father, in the complicated way of certain fathers, trying to say something true in a way that was too oblique to fully land. Might have been, in its own limited and imperfect way, a form of reaching. But I knew what I knew, and knowing what I knew, the words had a different quality. The quality of a man who senses, perhaps, that something is moving, who does not know the specific shape of it, but who has begun to feel, in the particular way of people who have done things they know, may eventually catch up with them, the specific atmosphere that precedes a reckoning. I said nothing about it. I filed it with everything else. The reckoning came as planned, and now here I am, on the other side of it, telling you this story in the full knowledge that telling it changes it, that the act of narrative always simplifies and shapes things that in their living were messier and more continuous and less organized around the moments of apparent significance. The real story had hundreds of ordinary days for every moment I've described. It had Tuesday mornings and Thursday evenings, and all the long, unpunctuated middle portions of a life that were not about any of this, and were also, because they were mine, part of the context in which all of this was happening. The real story also had kindnesses, unexpected ones, in unexpected places. A mentor at the firm in my first 3 years who saw something in my approach and invested time in developing it, who had no particular reason to do so beyond the simple generosity of a person who takes satisfaction in helping someone grow. A friend from college, a man named Curtis, with whom I've stayed in touch across 15 years, who has the particular quality of friendship that asks nothing and offers everything, who has made several visits possible and several difficult periods genuinely more manageable simply by being the kind of person he is. Small and ordinary kindnesses from people who had no part in the larger story and no knowledge of it, who were simply people living their lives with decency and who happened to intersect with mine. I try not to lose sight of those. I don't always succeed, but I try. The long game costs what the long game costs, and it produces what it produces, and the person who emerges from it is the person the long game made, which is a different person from the person who would have emerged from a different choice. I've said all of this already, but I want to leave you with this, because I think it is the most honest and the most important thing I can say after everything else I've said. The machine was real. The damage was real. The 20 years were real. The transaction was real, and it was just, and it was earned, and it was complete. And the boy who stood in the hallway at 16, who made a decision in the dark, who held the weight of that decision for 2 decades without breaking, that boy was not extraordinary in any way I can identify that was innate. He was not stronger or smarter or more resilient by nature than any other 16-year-old who has ever stood at the moment of fundamental betrayal and had to decide what to do. What he was determined, not in the aggressive or aggressive adjacent sense of the word, determined. In the original sense, he had determined a direction and he went in it, step by step, day by day, without the comfort of knowing whether it would work, without the certainty that he was doing the right thing, without any guarantee of anything other than the clarity of his own purpose. That clarity is available to anyone. It doesn't require extraordinary resources or extraordinary talent. It requires the willingness to carry a truth carefully, to build towards something slowly, and to refuse, in the particular and costly way that refusing requires, to be made into the person that someone else's machine was designed to make you. He refused, and the machine is gone now. And here we are.